Can you take us through the history of homelessness in California and Skid Row? And
Yeah, it's a really big topic. I think that when Americans talk about homelessness, I don't think that we realize how long we've been having these issues of being unhoused. I mean, starting since the post-Civil War, we had homelessness. You had a lot of soldiers who no longer had jobs or really places to go. And so the trains offered a way or an escape. The railroads offered an escape to find lodging, housing, work, etc. And so the stacks are the people holding like the poles with the, like the fabric behind them, like those images of early homelessness seems very quaint now. But in the 1920s, I think we saw the creation of modern homelessness, where you started to see houses, specifically houses for vagrants and housing for people who were intoxicated, begin to emerge in the East Coast, but also on the West Coast. And so a part of that movement was Taylorism, and specifically kind of the movement of industrialization at that time period of Ford, of if we are able to change the bodies and make people work, eventually they won't be homeless anymore. And so you start to see a lot of churches and a lot of community groups open these housings and open these kind of like soup kitchens, etc., for unhoused individuals. And in the 1920s, we actually see this kind of like this talking about housing insecurity emerge, specifically with soldiers who from World War I and the Civil War, who didn't necessarily get the government benefits that they wanted. So you see the first like soldiers march on Washington in the 1920s and late 1910s. And so 1930s, we have the Wall Street crash. And so what you have is a country that is lacking jobs, lacking resources, etc. And so what emerges is this these hoovervilles. And so they were named after Hoover, the president of that time period. And so what they were these collections of people who would create their own parts of town, their own shanties, these shantyvilles in the middle of cities. And so there in Los Angeles, there's actually a Hooverville that was created like in the early 1930s that sits like right in downtown LA. There were Hoovervilles all throughout the Midwest, Hoovervilles throughout the East Coast. And so these were just collections of people who created their own communities because there weren't a lot of resources. So this was before government assistance, government housing, a lot of the social safety networks that we have now weren't around then. So people had to kind of fend for themselves. Now, also with these Hoovervilles or these shanties, you have a racial element too. So also during this point in time, you have African Americans who were also suffering from housing insecurity, etc. And so there becomes this like policing of Hoovervilles. So some Hoovervilles had like more police presence than other Hoovervilles. And so the Hoovervilles, especially in the 1930s, started to get this negative light cast upon them. And in some cases, a very racial and very anti-poverty or anti-poor light. And so some of the newspaper reportings of that time period talks about like gold tooth, muscle bound Black people having knife fights, etc. But also during this time period, you have one of the largest deportation movements in American history that actually occurred in 1932, where over thousands of Mexican Americans were repatriated back to Mexico. Many of these families were residents of California. But during this time period, we had a very anti-illegal or anti-immigrant sentiment, specifically coming from Mexico. And also you have the creation of the Dust Bowl at this time period. Now, this is where it becomes very LA-centric and very California-centric. So with the Dust Bowl, you have this migration of folks from Oklahoma and folks from Texas coming to California, because California at that time period kind of cast themselves as the escape. We have lots of jobs, we have lots of land, it's beautiful, the weather, etc. And so folks from the Midwest and the East Coast, they see these beautiful images of California with the promise of jobs and agriculture. And so They moved to California. Now, in California at this time period, specifically of Los Angeles, they started to realize that too many people were migrating in. Too many poor people were migrating in. And so the Chamber of Commerce worked with the Los Angeles Police Department. And what they established is what is known as the bum blockade. And so for a 1-year period, the Los Angeles City of Commerce worked with the LAPD and worked with other outside police departments, specifically on border towns of Oregon and Arizona, to stop all trains coming into California to ensure that people had financial means and they looked like they had financial means in order to come into California. And if they didn't, well, they were sent right back and not allowed into California. And so what happens is that we now have this policy of who can be in a state, who can't be in a state. We have this huge deportation movement. We have these shantyvilles that are coming up, these hoovervilles. And so the 1930s represent this really big change and this movement to talk about housing insecurity, to talk about what does being an American citizen mean? What does migration mean during this time period? And then the federal government begins to act. And so during this time period in 1935, we begin to establish the social safety network. And so we start to have jobs programs specifically for men so that they can be the breadwinners of their house. We start the high wave movement in which now people have jobs for that. And then also we start to clean up these hoovervilles. And so we start to create public housing, specifically in more urban areas. And so just kind of looking at that brief history of the 1930s, we see that this history of homelessness and housing and just all of these issues they kind of harken back to like what we are experiencing now. And we kind of see how connected a lot of these issues are. And then in the 1940s and 1950s, I mean, you start to see the second great migration of African Americans moving out of the South into these urban areas. And so what happens is you have these urban areas that in many cases, we're not ready for segregation or integration. And you now have a huge influx of folks coming in. And so the modern unhousing movement or the modern homeless epidemic has like multiple levels. And so when we say like, oh, the issue of homelessness, I think you have to consider like which wave of homelessness that we're currently in. So the wave before the one that we're currently in, I think we can see began like in the late 1970s, early 1980s with the crack cocaine boom, and specifically the NIMBYism of downtown areas. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But the situation in LA and specifically Skid Row comes from like this movement of the 1960s to transform downtown areas to make them more commercial and for people to come to. And so you have places like Chicago, you have places like Seattle, you have places in New York, like the Bowery. And then you also have in LA, this little part of town called Bunker Hill, which is right next to downtown LA. And so these areas got basically razed. And a lot of businesses and high rises took over these formerly kind of like communal working class areas that were close to downtowns. And that wiped out a lot of the housing for poor folks. And it wiped out a lot of the resources for a lot of poor folks. And so in some cities like Seattle and Chicago, those folks moved to different parts of the city, and places like New York, they went to other boroughs. In LA, those folks that lost their housing moved to some districts, but predominantly if you were like and living in abject poverty, the next place to go was Skid Row.